Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today, I'm sharing a conversation I had with Wes Moldogo and Lauren Grigsby. And we're talking together about care for veterans at the end of life. We'll also discuss the Central Oregon Veterans Ranch project and learn all about how that's working and talk about upstream care for veterans to make end of life care easier later in life. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel. Also, subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you happen to listen to the podcast. And if you're so inclined and you're willing to make a small contribution, go to eoluniversity.com/support. There you'll find 3 different ways you can make as little as a couple of dollars a month contribution to help keep this channel and the podcast on the air. Thank you. Today, I'm very excited to be welcoming 2 guests to the podcast, and I'll introduce them both. First, Wes Moldogo. Wes serves as a 3-hat chaplain, a hospice chaplain, an on-call overnight chaplain, and as a chaplain for the Oregon Army National Guard's Infantry Regiment. It's the 2-162 Infantry Regiment. Not sure I said that the right way. Wes completed his Master of Divinity at Portland Seminary of George Fox and his clinical chaplain residency at Stanford Healthcare in Palo Alto, California. He has completed 2 overseas tours in the Horn of Africa and the Middle East and is an adamant supporter in palliating spiritual pain upstream so it doesn't become detrimental at the end of life. And along with Wes, I'm welcoming Lauren Grigsby. Lauren served 5 years in the Marine Corps, deploying overseas to Iraq as a logistics officer. For her final assignment on active duty, she had the honor to serve as a Casualty Assistance Calls Officer, CACO, escorting the remains of fellow Marines and soldiers from Iraq to Dover Air Force Base. Following her time in the Corps, along with other work as a government contractor, wife, and mother, Lauren has acted as a caregiver to a family member with glioblastoma brain cancer, advocated alongside national veteran service organizations for the VA PACT Act on Capitol Hill, and has companioned a fellow Marine Corps peer who lost her fight to breast cancer in March of 2022. She is now the co-executive director at Central Oregon Veterans Ranch and is an end-of-life doula with the Peaceful Presence Project. You can learn more about the Central Oregon Veterans Ranch at the website covranch.org. And I'm very happy to have both Wes and Lauren here to continue our discussion about veteran care, which started way back, I think it was over a year and a half ago, with Quinn Galloway Salazar coming on. And now I'm so glad we have this chance to follow up. So welcome, Wes and Lauren. Yeah, I'm excited that we're connected in various ways through knowing about Quinn's work and also through the Peaceful Presence Project. And Aaron and Elizabeth have been on the podcast, and I continue to have a relationship with them. So I'm really excited now that you two are part of the circle and I get to know you. And Lauren, I thought maybe we should start, since we mentioned the Central Oregon Veterans Ranch, just start by having you tell us a little bit more about the ranch.
Well, the Veterans Ranch was created in 2004, and it is a working ranch that restores purpose to veterans of all ages and eras. And what we had is our founder, Allison Perry, was working in the VA mental health system, and she was noticing an increase in mental health, re-traumatization and behavioral problems in these clinical environments. And she just kept saying, if we only had some sort of ranch that people could go to. She also was seeing a lot with her Vietnam patients, this soul injury. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Deborah Grassman and Opus Peace, but they very much dive into that idea of soul injury from the work she has done as a care nurse in the VA system. And they would say, I I feel like I left my soul over there. So there was this two-part of giving veterans a place that was peaceful and in nature, that they could potentially go to die without all of the things that were triggering them in the more clinical environments. And then also there was this piece of bringing purpose back to the veterans. Of purpose and dignity, I think, is extremely important in this space, in the end of life space, in the mental health space for veterans.
Oh, that makes so much sense. And I love the idea. I had a thought a while back that, those who join the military go through, well, boot camp or recruit training for what, like 6 to 8 weeks of training in order to become part of the military. And why don't we have a similar training when people leave military to help them re-enter our society in a way? I mean, helping them heal and recover from whatever they've experienced in the military. And the ranch sounds like it serves a really important function in that way.
What you see is there's these different life phases. What you need when you're transitioning out of the military as a veteran, it can be very different than what you need when you're middle-aged and you have your family and your career, and you're just trying to keep your head above water with all of the activities and the work that you have. And then as you age, our bodies are breaking down faster than our peers within the civilian population. That's also very difficult, to have mental decline, especially from things like traumatic brain injury, and then have physical decline just because we pushed our bodies so hard when we were younger. And that all affects you, as you this is probably a good transition to Wes and upstream care, because how do we start with prevention now?
Yeah, Wes, I was interested in that because it's part of your bio that you mentioned palliating spiritual pain upstream, and so please talk more about that and why it's so important in terms of helping with end of life care.
No, thanks for that, Karen. And I throw on upstream a lot, and I always get the look of what's upstream, right? And so starting off just upstream at its base and core, and I don't know if this is a commonly agreed definition, but I kind of feel like it is, at least in hospice and palliative care. It's more of what is happening before that acute care happens, and then post-acute care. So in other words, that type of care before that hospital admission, if you want to call it a hospital admission, and then afterwards when everything is going on when you discharge from the hospital. Here's an example. You got a guy with maybe some moral injury or maybe some combat PTSD. You think, what does that have to do with his healthcare? But because maybe he might be maybe a Vietnam veteran, doesn't like talking about death, but a lot of his pain, his or her pain, may involve watching a lot of death. And so when he goes to the hospital for something that might have a terminal prognosis, where death becomes, a very reoccurring topic, he shies away from that conversation, which in turn inhibits the outcome of maybe getting on a hospice sooner. It might be a relief for him and his family to be on hospice sooner. And then subsequently, we're doing things last minute where, they're getting on a hospice late, we're getting him the comfort medications, but at the same time, had there been a freeway exit to talk about the death and dying, I mean, this could have been mitigated to a large part. This guy could have had closure, and I'm not saying every veteran does if we were to address that, but at least we tried, and it would have been out of the best interest, and he might have been open to it if it was socialized differently. And so, when I talk about the passion for upstream care, the way we talk about these taboo topics and things we're uncomfortable in talking about. I personally, maybe not just from a veteran to veteran, like I care about the veteran community standpoint, but even on a personal religious conviction level, I mean, I gotta love the neighbor and say, hey, please consider, this as a space to talk about something that may be an issue later. But at the same time, we have to do that weird tension of, how involved do you want to get, that person's autonomy. That's ebb and flow. Yeah. But I think offering is a big deal in holding space.
Yeah, I'm sure as a chaplain, you've seen situations, which I've seen in hospice, where sometimes a person's on their deathbed. I mean, literally, a day or two away from dying and suddenly have a need to talk about certain spiritual issues that, we have to stop and think we're doing it here at the last minute, at this last moment. The chaplain gets called in when maybe these things could have been addressed earlier on, and it might have made for an easier time at the end of life.
I know these aren't comfortable topics, but at the end of the day, and this is very subjective to my experience, I believe Lauren might have remarks about this later as well, but I would say more veterans would probably want to talk about this, given it's with the right people that hold the right space. And that's why I'm just so passionate about like the Veterans Ranch, what the hospices in Central Oregon are doing, and then just generally what I see the direction trending in.
And it often feels like, oh gosh, if only this process could have started months ago or years ago, and we were helping people. And so I love the idea that the ranch is actually doing that. And you mentioned, Lauren, giving people dignity and also purpose in their lives, which every one of us, we need to have that. We need to be aware that our lives mean something.
Yeah. And that dignity is something that we often do for ourselves. And that's something that there's this point where someone has to hold that dignity for us when you're dying. Right. And it's the same way that in birth, like who holds dignity for a child before they understand that concept for themselves. And that's why, the whole concept of a death doula is so amazing, because it's holding both sides. Right.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Holding that presence and then creating a safe space wherein a person feels safe to begin to heal or to look at some of the issues that need to heal.
Yeah.
And I wonder if for veterans, are there very many safe spaces? Do veterans feel very safe in spaces? Because it seems to me a lot of what veterans have experienced may be really hard for them to talk about or just share with the general public.
I think if I just look at my own ideas of safety, right? Like we live in a beautiful place. We kind of live in an island, like a desert island, right? Because we're separated from a lot of other areas of the state by the mountains. And so geographically, we have a very safe place, like my kids go to a beautiful, safe school. But when you talk about being able to have conversations of all aspects of who you are and what's your foundation underneath you as a civilian now, there was a hesitancy I had to have conversations about my military service with civilians that I got to know here. And I didn't realize I even had that void in my own life of being able to have those conversations. Because no one was saying, don't have those conversations with me. I just wasn't feeling comfortable enough to have them with others. It was this automatic assumption of, I don't expect them to understand. I don't want to burden those individuals with how heavy some of these things are. So I'll just keep it to myself. And then you go out to somewhere like the ranch, and everyone has those same, like the distress tolerance among the population is just a little bit higher. It's just like it can be higher among hospice nurses and doctors. And, there's like everyone, but it takes people a long time too to see that there's likeness in that. And I think one of the best things for me in this community is that a lot of the civilians I got to know were hospice nurses and ER doctors. And I saw that they had a lot of the same distress tolerance that I had formed being in the military. So it allowed us to see each other, right? But you don't always see that when you first come out of the military. So having a space like that, it's really important.
Yeah. How about for you, Wes? Any thoughts on that idea that a safe space for a veteran to talk may be different than spaces we create for other patients?
Yeah, no, it kind of, I'm going to piggyback on Lauren's thing. I think there's a very unique community relationship fostered by veteran to veteran, and in hospice, it will, at least most hospices will try to pair up like a volunteer veteran with, a veteran at end of life. But like, you want to go back to more of that upstream conversation to currently serving members. what's funny is that, and maybe you can speak to this too, Lauren. I mean, you serve with people you may not even really like at the end of the day, and then like at the end of the day, you still feel some comfortable space at some point, maybe not at the beginning or middle, maybe not even at the end. Maybe it'll be like after you get out, but to be able to share because they kind of get it, because they can understand, yeah, I was in Fallujah, right? Or yeah, I was in, Erbil, Iraq. And I just find the unconditional, although the relationship was initiated by an institution, overall, it wasn't like this personal, I'm going to come up to you and talk to you like that it's almost this unconditional bond, right? So there's that upstream. I think when you get out of the military and you approach a place like the Veterans Ranch as a veteran, there's like a reminder of that, very informally, or maybe it is formal. I mean, you advertise that on the site, right? But it's that same space.
No, what you're saying there, I think it's curious, and maybe, maybe there's not enough information. It's just anecdotal evidence of me observing, but how many veterans that have lost touch with their comrades from whatever unit they serve with, because maybe there was something that happened in their unit that was, extremely traumatizing or frustrating. And so what happens is, as part of that compartmentalization process, is to break contact, because breaking contact means you don't have to think about it, right? You don't need to watch the news. You don't need to talk to those old people. You don't need, you just gonna compartmentalize it away, fold it all up in this corner, and you're gonna go on with your life over here without thinking about it. And I think, I was very fortunate that I had a group of Marine girlfriends that we stayed in touch from the time we were first doing training when we were 18, 19 years old to now. But that, I realize, is an anomaly, because most of these guys are just breaking free of everything they know, and then they're just going into their civilian lives, and they're not having that community.
Yeah, I remember a phrase thrown out there, and I don't know if it's an official one, but trauma bonding was one of the phrases thrown out. And yeah, I see that need being, I can't tell you how many times at some point someone said, gosh, I wonder how that guy is doing. I'm talking about the veterans at end of life, right? So that's definitely a space. Another safe space, I guess officially procured by the military, and I bet Lauren is familiar with this as well, is that chaplains kind of serve that function in the military. And so they, just summarizing, the highest level of confidentiality, and they often get the intentional, hey, I want to speak to you, even though maybe that service member is not religious, but because they have a high level of confidentiality, and supposedly they're supposed to have a reflective skill set of counseling, that they're supposed to provide that. And so that there are some more leeways upstream, but I'm just wondering, even despite that, are you still going to have someone, and there is the chaplain able to connect with that person? Is the unit, affirming of that person going to go see the chaplain? And most recently, we've included behavioral health. They're typically, LCSW folk, and I want to say they're including LPCs now to commission as mental health officers in the military. But I mean, are they going to feel comfortable sharing a lot of their pain and distress that far upstream? And so, in many ways, the Veteran Ranch is so interesting, because you get out, you tend to be a lot more reflective in life. I think of the folks that die down in testosterone, when they get older, and they become more reflective. And that really is a great highway exit point for a lot of this stuff. And that's why I'm just so high on the Veterans Ranch personally.
I was just going to say, as you're talking, and I think of my father, and I mentioned before that he was a World War II veteran who died later in life of suicide. But that what I came to understand of my dad is he had experienced a lot of trauma during World War II, that he had no one to talk to about it, and really isolated himself in that regard, keeping all those feelings inside, and didn't have a safe space, no contact with any of his of the people that he had served with. So it comes home to me in a personal way that it is so important that we make sure we're providing these spaces that are comfortable and feel safe, and the opportunities for veterans to connect with others who will understand what they might have experienced during their service.
Yeah. And I think it's pretty amazing right now to see that when you look at the Iraq, Afghanistan veterans and the Vietnam and Korea, because those are kind of the four campaigns we see a lot of right now, there are so many things about Vietnam and these Middle Eastern campaigns that we can talk to each other about. And there is a mentorship and a peer relationship across, this 50-year span, because we see the similarities. We see the similarities in environmental exposures. We see the similarities in, traumatic stress. We see the similarities in the politics, and we're able to talk about those things together and help each other heal. And then we have these very different generational mindsets too about life, because, the Vietnam vets, they had to come home and not only were they naturally compartmentalizing in a way, it was not societally accepted that they were even in Vietnam. So they're a gritty bunch. They know how they're extremely resilient. They're hard workers. They just bring something to the way they work out at the ranch that just reminds everyone around them that, I don't know a good analogy to use without it sounding coarse, but basically like suck it up and like let's get to work. And sometimes you need that too. And sometimes they need, there's a little bit more emotional intelligence and well-roundedness and in understanding your feelings among the younger generations, right? We're talking those that are in their early 30s and younger right now. It's amazing how much more emotionally intelligent they are and aware of their feelings, but they also don't have that same gritty resolve that we see in the Vietnam vets all the time. So there's just this partnership that feeds into, like I said, mentorship, mentees, finding their purpose again. And everyone just appreciates each other fully. And it's a beautiful thing to see.
I should have asked earlier, do the veterans live on the ranch or they just come there to work?
Yeah, everyone that we work with out the ranch is housed, and they just come out there. And they're not even, veterans aren't required to work there. We actually keep a full agricultural staff to do all the work at the ranch. That way it never feels like the ranch would fall apart without the veteran labor, right? So veterans can just come sit by the fire pit. They can just come, have lunch on Thursdays. They can just come and walk around the fields and take a moment because something in their life is not going well that day. But if they want to work, they can work. And that's where we see, there's just a couple of Vietnam vets. It's like, that's what they come there to do. They come and they're there for every, hydroponics iteration of the week, and they do their hydroponics and they leave. They're not there to socialize. They're not there, but they get their agritherapy in, for the week. So it's interesting. Everyone can kind of do whatever suits them. It's gone from being very structured in the military to very unstructured. I think I heard someone describe it as you've kept the camaraderie, but you've taken away all the things that felt frustrating and containing and controlling, right?
Have either one of you seen specific cases or specific stories where you've seen someone transform because of this opportunity to work on the ranch, or even, as you were saying, Wes, to get more upstream care for their pain?
People will directly say to us, "This ranch has saved me." And all of our staff, but one, are veterans, and the one that's not a veteran, he might as well be. He's just someone that the entire staff and all the veteran community love and respect. And I think, even among some of our staff members, there's this realization that subjects like suicide aren't just something that we're talking about. It's something that we see firsthand within our community. It's something we saw while we were all still in the military. It's something we've seen around, peers in the military who've taken their lives. And it's something that we see at the ranch, either someone being at that edge and coming out of it, or they're the ones we can't catch too, because those are there. And I think if everywhere could have a place like this, a landing spot, when someone is in crisis and in that moment of need, they can go. We do have like the county has a stabilization center, but again, that's clinical, right? But to have a non-clinical space where you can go, you can see people. If I walk the field with someone, I can see them go from over the top crisis level to calm in a matter of 15 minutes. Just like getting them to just lay down on the ground and just connect back to the earth again and take some deep breaths and then walk something off is huge. Having people like staff there, that we don't have to have the solutions for anyone, right? We understand that we are not the next level of care. There's boundaries around what type of support we can provide. And then we try to, again, push people to the next level of care if they need, a recovery service, or they need mental health support or stabilization or whatever it may be. But the fact that they just have somewhere to land, it's really hard to put a statistic to, because we have a success that they're still alive, right? But I see it firsthand working all the time.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then Wes, how about for you in terms of your work? I mean, you were saying how you have the different hats of being in hospice on the one hand and working with veterans on the other hand, but do you find there is a lot of crossover, that you're helping the veterans you serve to prepare for the end of life, or that end of life issues come up as you're working with them?
No, that's definitely the hope, and that's why I'm so hopeful for the key state players in Central Oregon. But the example that comes to mind is actually not from Central Oregon. So my National Guard unit's out there in that Springfield, Eugene area, and National Guard units, I think theoretically they're ingrained in the community, and so this National Guard unit, they're supported by their local VFW. I think a lot of them are around this country, and they support us for a lot of our holiday events. And so I started chatting up this Vietnam veteran at one of the holiday events, and we actually just kept in touch. I actually made the remark, hey, you're infantry, this unit's infantry, you should come out and just talk about what it was like being infantry in Vietnam, and so that was in December, like a couple of years ago when I just joined. Never heard back from him for a couple of months. I come to find out that he was constantly being readmitted to the hospital. I'm not part of that healthcare system, so I can't look at the chart. But what his family expressed to me was that it seemed to be heart failure. It sounded like he had an ejection fraction percentage of less than 20%. He's probably New York Heart Association stage 4. I mean, the way they were talking about it. But there was this big hesitancy, even though he would have qualified for hospice, to not do it. And I offered to reach out because I thought I connected with him so well. He was just a cool, vulgar guy. I'm not saying I'm a cool, vulgar guy, but it was the humor that really connected us. And they're like, do you want to talk to him? He's not a religious guy, but he's always appreciated the chaplain, because in Vietnam, they love their chaplain, right? So I talked to him, and really when it came down to it, it was in his house. I guess the heart failure led to some renal stuff, and then subsequently some COPD stuff. He was using his very little breath he had to express to me, yeah, I don't like death and dying, and AKA hospice, because it reminds me of the death and dying in Vietnam, right? And I mean, this shouldn't be a news flash for a lot of folk, but it's that type of a little more upstream intervention. And that's not even really upstream in the way I describe upstream, but it is upstream to a lot of folk. That it's those were kind of those crucial conversations could take place, which inevitably could affect the outcome. And so I'm not saying I got the ball rolling, but I'm saying I was able to have some harder discussion involving what hospice was, the philosophy, and it's about probably more aggressive comfort than sending it to die at the end of the day. And I think his family really got on the ball after that with that momentum, and they were able to say, this is what's great for us. We think it's honoring of you and your late wife. It's those types of freeway exits for those harder conversations that I think that's a big part of the palliative care game, and community care, subsequently. So that's the example that comes to my mind. And I hope to see more of that in Central Oregon. I think we're making great progress.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that I've seen myself, veterans refusing hospice care or being uncomfortable with hospice care. And I was never quite sure of all the reasons why there was discomfort there, but it seems like we do need to do something. We do need to be providing education and information earlier, because it's very hard when someone needs hospice care. It's hard to delay it so that while we try to get them to accept it and buy into that.
There's this idea that they've given up if they're no longer receiving treatments. So we watch them delay it and delay it and delay it. And then they're on a hospice a very short period of time because they just wouldn't give up. And that's a beautiful thing, that they have that much resolve to live.
That's something I've always wished in hospice that we could convey, because hospice has become associated with the idea of giving up and letting go of care, that we could convey the idea that you can be just as passionate about being alive and living every moment of your life and be on hospice, because hospice is just getting extra care to make sure you're comfortable at the end of life. But that's a really hard message to get across to people.
Yeah. And I think that's another reason, like the whole palliative care area of support needs to be better understood, because you can give it, it just helps so much with that transition. And then there is so much of that same care that they can give while they, but it's just a misunderstood area, I think, in the terminal illness world, right?
Yeah, definitely.
By the caregivers and the patients.
Sure. It's definitely misunderstood for all people. And then it seems to me that for some veterans, it could be that there's a value in being strong and in not needing extra help, and it may feel like weakness or something to be part of hospice.
Yeah, I think earlier in the program, Lauren made the remark about the culture where the remark from veterans to other veterans was "suck it up," and I think that there's a place for that. There's wisdom for that, but at the same time, part of especially when we talk about the doulas and their work and shaping, or I should say, doing community literacy in death, dying, and I want to say palliative care as well. It really involves shaping that culture. It's really reinforcing that this is not a totally taboo thing. And by the way, let's connect this to what's been going on in the past. They're so unique.
Yeah, and I think that the conversations around being vulnerable in general have to happen. Like being vulnerable around the idea of death is the next level. And if you can't be vulnerable around just normal things, everyday things, then it's really hard by the time you get to that stage to accept it in. So we really spend a lot of time as staff at the Veterans Ranch working on ourselves and that whole, that idea of being a whole person and being okay with pushing into vulnerability and being the first ones to push into vulnerability, to tell our story first, to put ourselves out there first. It's like always showing your cards, and that's hard to do. You're pulling from potentially the depth of your well for empathy when you're talking about shared lived experience. So you have to be able to push into that space, help people be vulnerable by doing it first, and then also still have your own self-care, right? But it is effective. It's effective. It just needs like that constant looking at boundaries and checking in with yourself and having buddies to check in with for accountability for your mental health. And it's also interesting when we talk about death and not even just the younger people, but yes, let's look at the Vietnam guys, right? They know that they had a lot of other environmental exposures that are really, making their life expectancy shorter than even veterans of wars before that. And they are not, they are still wanting to live another 30, 40 years. They don't want to die. They don't want to think about death. We have this population that accepted somewhere a long time ago that you could die any moment, right? Immediate death was something that everyone in the military space understands, whether it's an accident or in combat or, you tripped and hit your head, like you could die any second. And I think once you flip that switch and made that acceptance, you don't think about questions like, what do I want my legacy to be when I die at 110? What do I want my memorial service to look like when, if I could plan that, what does that look like? They don't even ask that question. They've accepted this idea of immediate death, but they don't think about long-term planning towards that, because it's I don't know if it's something psychologically, like if you accepted one, you turned off even the conversation in your own mind for the other one. I don't know.
It's interesting, like being in a state of crisis readiness all the time, where you're ready in the moment for something to happen. But as you said, it's hard to shift your thinking into, oh, I'll be here for 20 or 30 more years. I've got to think about what I'm going to do down the road. So it is interesting. There are two very different types of thinking and planning ahead.
And like in the doula space, like if you can think in that way, that long-term planning way, well, then you can get into advanced directives and you can get into planning long-term care. You can get into legacy projects. You can get into all of that earlier if you can think that way earlier. But what we're seeing, especially around like veteran legacy projects, is a rush of legacy projects and not enough volunteers to record all of them, because they're all happening at once, because it all was left to the very end.
Yeah. So hence, again, the need for more upstream work. And I liked that you emphasized for doulas how important like self-care is, and just learning how to be present as your whole self and bring your whole self into the work. And I'm sure that's true for you, Wes, as well. As a chaplain, you also have to be able to be present when you're listening and sitting with someone and being vulnerable yourself and being fully there for them.
Absolutely. This kind of goes against the grain from the veteran to veteran connection, but I also acknowledge very much at the same time that there have been great people, great outcomes for folks that have supported veterans that weren't veterans. If I recall correctly, and I hope Allison Perry doesn't get mad at me, like my first impression of her when I first met her, she's not a veteran, but she helped found the Veterans Ranch. I thought my impression of her was that she would not do great with veterans, but after seeing her in action, she was able to hold space so well that it didn't even matter she was, right? And so, long story short, that holding of the space, I mentioned in, what's his name? Saul Ebenezer's podcast. It's called Hospice Chaplaincy. That is probably the crux. I mean, every doula will tell you the same thing, right? You could be from the most opposite background, but have this shared space that's sacred. And that's why I appreciate Lauren and the doulas so much out here.
Yeah. The sacredness of shared space. I love that term. And you mentioned it before too, Lauren, of being willing to be vulnerable first yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not easy for any of us to be vulnerable, but it's part of our job in a way when we're working with other people at the end of life. Yeah.
And then these stories, once they come back, you might give a small vulnerability, right? But if they do, like that trust is earned and they start telling their stories back to you, what I often see too is they'll test your ability to be unflinching. And they'll test whether or not you can actually hold for their story. So there's that moment where you have to be so level and just non-judgmental and open and just listening and making that eye contact and pushing into any discomfort their story may make you feel, because you're human, you're going to feel discomfort from stories that are intense, right? But it's so important in that moment where they start opening up to just really be there and then know that you're not running away from their trauma.
Yes. Oh, yes, exactly. And which is why I think you use the term distress tolerance. I think that all of us in this type of work, we have to develop our own distress tolerance so that we can embrace whatever we're hearing, whatever is happening around us, and be there for it. But you learn that in the military, I'm sure.
Yeah. But again, you've learned it in the hospice space. Allison Perry, she has that distress tolerance. Deborah Grassman has that distress tolerance. I work with doulas through the Peaceful Presence Project, that they're not veterans, but veterans are close to their heart because of a family member. So they have developed, because it's important to them, and they want to be there because ultimately they're doing the work because they hope it's going to reach their father or their mother, or their grandparents. And so it's powerful to see that it doesn't have to just be peer-to-peer veteran, right? To hold space at end of life for veterans, but you just kind of have to know how to be trauma informed and how to be a present listener and companion.
One of the concerns that I have is the number of veterans who are unhoused, who end up dying on the streets. Like the need to be able to provide palliative care for those who are unhoused. And I don't know if either of you have done any work in that area or have any thoughts about that.
I know just one example. So we hear, and maybe the way that we are kind of an island, geographically, population wise, we have kind of one of everything, it seems like. And then that makes it really easy to create systems compared to if you're in a larger area. So like we are dealing with, housed veterans, and but then we also have Central Oregon Veteran Outreach locally in our area that works with homeless veterans. And I know that the Peaceful Presence Project also goes out and does work specifically with homeless camps. I was trying to do advanced directives, trying to talk about palliative care, because a lot of them do have terminal illnesses and or some sort of addictions that's leading to major health problems. So one thing that COVO has started doing is trying to get people into palliative care and into hospice if they need it. And there's an individual that's on hospice right now that came through that channel through them. And then I'm now working on just companionship, doula work with her, and she's a Vietnam vet, and then working on just kind of legacy story and helping her release some of these things now before she passes.
And how about for you, Wes? Any thoughts about that?
No, but both of me and Lauren's feet are kind of dipped in the same pool. So I was also going to mention those very two same organizations. So to piggyback on what Lauren said, and it kind of goes back to the doula model of involving community and how I emphasize community in that upstream care. The Peaceful Presence Project collaborated with the Homeless Coalition here, who subsequently collaborated with the city of Bend. Because, and I don't know, a place where this may not be as big of an issue, but it seems to be pretty consistent in a lot of bigger cities, the issue of homelessness and what's at its core. I mean, why are we getting these constant readmits, into the healthcare system that are people that are homeless? And so finally, someone had the idea, why not try advanced care planning to offset and deal with things that probably are more, as medical as it is, it might be non-medical. So as you know, when you do advanced care planning with that advanced directive, you reflect on your life, basically. Who do you have in your corner? Lack of people, right? And so that, in addition to, is it called the homeless, or is it called the Veterans Village, Lauren, the Veterans Outreach funded or helped create?
Yes. And that's a temporary housing village. And most of the time in that situation, they're trying to get, they're working with different job resources to try to get them back into employment. And then also Bethlehem Inn often will take people that have, that are clean. So.
No, that's perfect, because going back to upstream stuff, and you want to talk about highway exits or freeway exits, where you can have that nice conversation in that space for something significant going on in a veteran's life. And also, this is kind of it's sharing the same space of what, the city may view as an issue within the city or the general area. I mean, it hits on a lot of things, and that's why it's holistic just generally, but it's even more holistic now that it's upstream. So I think Central Oregon, I mean, in many ways, they are a model already of what it could look like, but I just hope someone here listens to this from some other place and runs with it and creates some better idea of stuff we're already doing.
Yeah. It's huge that all of our different organizations talk, and we're working all the time to not be in silos, and not to say that there's silos, that there aren't silos, because there definitely are. We have a lot of conversations left to have a system around this and around veteran care. But at least we're all engaged with each other, and we're having those conversations, and we're trying to figure out how it looks.
Yeah, that's something I feel passionate about, is the need to form coalitions, because no one organization can fix the problems that we have, because they're all multifactorial. And so we need more groups available. And I really liked, Wes, you made the point earlier that the VA has the advantage of having funding that some other organizations may not have. Because if I can look at one issue for lots and lots of nonprofit organizations that are trying to work on causes around the end of life, it's a lack of funding. But the VA has funding for healthcare, and as you said, could be a good prototype or a model of how to work on some of these problems, how to provide upstream care, that could be duplicated in other settings. And we can learn by trying these models out in a VA setting.
Yeah. And I think it's really helpful that when we talk about partners in this, it's not just the medical and the hospice and it's the VA, it's the vet center, it's the Central Oregon Veterans Council, it's the Deschutes County Veterans Service Officers. We're all talking, and we're all trying to coordinate with each other. It's the county court system. There's veterans that get into legal trouble. It's trying to help them at that stage. There's all of these different facets. And then if you're meeting them when they're in crisis, and then can start talking to them about fixing the underlying causes of whatever it may be, then that's extremely helpful. But even more helpful if they can get to it before they end up in crisis, right?
Yeah, exactly. Upstream, as we've been saying. Yeah. Well, I wanted to say the Central Oregon region is quite an example of collaboration and working together. And I'm really impressed with what the Peaceful Presence Project is doing, and then the Central Oregon Veterans Ranch. That sounds amazing, and hopefully something that could be replicated in other areas.
That's the hope. And earlier I mentioned like the continuum scale. I mean, I just hope at some point there's some map out there after they listen to this podcast, Karen. They'll listen to this and they'll say, well, I don't know, I have this really niche thing for, bereavement for veterans, which I bet that's out there, by the way, but probably a more specific framework to the level of what Deborah Grassman's done with soul injury and what Quinn's done with, I forget her program's name, but that's really specific, right, to that care.
In their honor.
Yes, right. And so I hope someone out there listens to this and says, hey, let's contact the Veterans Ranch, or, let's have our version of this here in our hometown. And that's kind of the hope, I don't want to put words in Lauren's mouth, but I'm I hope someone out there runs with this.
Yeah. That's why I'm excited that we get to spread the word a little bit about the ranch and all the things that are happening. And then again, this concept of upstream care, that when we help people address issues earlier on in their lives, it can change everything at the end of life. Wes, I know you talked about having some interventions that you use specifically with veterans, and I'm wondering what some of those are, and if you could describe those for us.
Yeah, no, I think even before that, I'll name some spiritual pains I've noticed trend wise, and like spirituality, commonly accepted in this field, would probably describe something that involves meaning, purpose, things related to the transcendent. It's usually things that are sacred to an individual. And a lot of times, we think of sacred things and things that are meaningful. We think good things, but at the same time, you look at a person's service, they may not have had a great experience in the service, but it's still negatively meaningful to them. And so I've cross-intersected that, tried to find common language, but for the most part, when I say spiritual pain for veterans at end of life, it usually does involve meaningful service, usually reinforced by the U.S. and their attitude and demeanor. Thank you for your service. Here's 2 holidays, Veterans Day, Memorial Day. And, if you don't have a good experience, it's this weird mixed bag of feelings that feels disenfranchised, or maybe only you know about it. And it's a really alone feeling, right? So anyway, I know 3 big trends, and they can often be related, but the reason why I distinguish between these 3 big spiritual pains is because they poke their head out for me to enough to say this is the primary, kind of like a primary diagnosis and maybe a secondary diagnosis, right? So the first one would be combat PTSD, mainly for our wartime veterans. And I mean, this could include elements of moral injury. In other words, you doing something that may be compromising to what your deeply held convictions are, or maybe this big regret, right? So any combat PTSD related to that or experiences. The second one I noticed would be anything involving dishonor in service. Sometimes it may involve combat PTSD. For example, I had to maybe make a split decision and kill a kid because he might have had something that looked like a gun. I mean, or witnessing something, right? And then not doing anything about it. That's another big one. And then finally, the third one surprised me. And I was surprised because I just don't hear about it a lot, but I think we might see more of a trend of this in the future. MSTs, and I know Lauren's talked about this already, or military sexual traumas. And when I say surprised, we didn't really start integrating women until maybe the last few decades, but as early as World War II veterans talking about some really bad sexual traumas, with them being the victim. Let me say this, I think each of them are unique in their own right, but for the most part, all 3 of these trends, they can overlap each other, but yeah, I'd say those are the 3 big trends I named.
One thing I wanted to ask about is survivor's guilt, because I've been aware of that some veterans almost feel guilty that they survived because they had comrades who died in combat. And I'm wondering if you see that coming up at the end of life also, or Lauren or Wes, either one of you.
Yes. So the survivor's guilt becomes something that's ever present. I don't think they ever lose that. I know my grandfather, one of the last things he had said to my father, and he was at PELLU, he was a corpsman, is he made a decision in his cancer care to take a large dose of chemotherapy without really considering that could really be hard on his body, and it actually caused his death. And his attitude about it was, well, I've already survived so many more years than the other guys. Mm. So it wasn't like a total flippancy about the life. He felt so grateful for being able to have 40, 50 more years than all these other guys. But that survivor's guilt was still there, even in the decisions he was making about his cancer care.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about, because, and as you said, how can we ever take that away from someone? How can we? It's hard for us to explain that away or take that away. That's just something that they carry with them.
Right. And you have to respect that. And that's like when Wes talks about the gesture of thank you for your service. It really is a thoughtful gesture. But when we only look at military service as a population from in terms of pride or esprit, or the good we've done, then we're not acknowledging all of these other things. And some questions that can be so simple to allow that acknowledgement are just starting off in a conversation with that individual by saying, what branch of service were you in? What were your experiences? Not putting a tone on it in your initial question, and allowing the tone to come from that individual. And then listening is so important. It's important at end of life companionship. It's important during life and peer support and building deep connections. So that starts with a thoughtful question that and then you being willing to hold that space, because you're going to get some big answers when you ask a thoughtful question.
That's a really good point. And I know, Wes, holding space is something that you've talked about as well, and that you practice in your work. So would you talk a little bit more about that?
But holding space is probably the biggest thing. If there's anything to take away from better end of life care, it would be holding space.
Wes, you had mentioned I think it's called the passing the torch. And I was curious about if you would describe that for us, what that is.
Yeah, let's talk about interventions. So I named those three, any spiritual pain related to combat, anything related to dishonor in service, and then anything related to specifically military sexual trauma or experiences in that direction, right? And so there are a ton of interventions. During my residency at Stanford, a couple of years ago, we had, and I don't know why heart failure, kidney stuff is so common. We had a guy with heart failure, kidney, comfort care at Stanford's GIP, very gruff old man, right? Army, Vietnam veteran. I'm pretty sure he was infantry, the way he talked about his service and specific battles. But he was one of those guys, it's not like people didn't try to connect with him, but there was a big measuring stick. It was like, can you hold the space, first of all? Talk about holding space. And not a lot of people from the team passed. And then you want to go in at a hospital, have the same folks coming in every so often, and just a different person every day. So, there's a lot of trust you had to build for this guy. But the one person that came every day, it was the CNA, this nursing assistant, who was still in college, and he was an Army reservist, never been in combat, right? I'm going to underline that. And what he would do was he would literally he knew he was a veteran too, and like he wore the Vietnam veteran hat. He would ask about it, and then he would disclose, hey, I'm an Army reservist. What advice can you give me? Right? He was very direct. And so this guy that was hard-nosed, you should have seen it. It was like he turned over a new leaf. He began to become the teacher to this young CNA. Shout outs to you, Avery. I don't know if you're a nurse, if you happen to be listening to this. You make a great hospice nurse. It became an everyday thing. And it became, I don't want this, but I want to see Avery, right? So that's kind of thing. So when I look at this places like the Central Oregon Veterans Ranch, they use a really strong peer support model, which models a lot of that. And I use the word peer-to-peer very specifically, and that has roots, peer-to-peer support models in prison. Who gets what and who connects with who? But when I talk about passing the torch technique for a lot of veterans dealing with those three spiritual pains, by the way, what I notice is it's almost like that veteran feels like they're talking to someone in time, in the future, and whatever closure you need, you feel like you left the world in a better place because you're talking to someone so freaking young. And it's such a weird thing. I wish, I'm pretty sure, they're trying stuff and trying to measure outcomes of this. How are we going to do it? I don't know. I'm sure the Veterans Ranch will figure it out. But I will say it isn't out of the question in the past for folks to have invited, I'm going to use National Guard folks as an example because I'm in the National Guard, young currently serving members in the National Guard, to hear some stories, because this is your lineage at the end of the day. I also can see it wouldn't be out of the question, for hospices to invite maybe Marine Corps reservists or Navy reservists, Air Force reservists as well, that are like these younger folks serving, to talk to veterans that have served in the same branch. What are congruent experiences? And all it does, it feeds into the pride. It gives people closure, and it has people feeling heard at the end of the day. But anyway, that's kind of the synopsis of the passing of the torch. And I find it to be a very powerful thing. I automatically end up doing it, as a hospice chaplain, because I'm a younger currently serving guy. And I really do squeak that to my advantage. And I'm sure there'd be other people like that too.
I love that idea, because what a great way to help give someone dignity and meaning and purpose at the end of life, to be able to become a teacher for someone younger and share their experiences and the wisdom that they've gained, and to take them out of the role of having to be a patient and having to be dependent on others, but to actually have something they can give back and be and help another with. I think that's a really wonderful technique.
Yeah.
Have you watched the Netflix film A Man Named Otto?
Yes. Yeah.
It's that joining of purpose and dignity. And that's exactly what we see. And just yesterday we were with a hospice patient. It was, and it was our peer support specialist, who was Afghanistan, me, who was Iraq, and a Vietnam veteran. And we have the best 2-hour conversations. It's just, it's really special. And there's so much that we understand about one another and learn from one another. And, my Uncle Tom, he always says, we as people, to have purpose, we need peers, we need mentors, and we need mentees. There's all three. And it's a system. And that's what the ranch does.
Wow. Oh, I love that idea. We need peers, we need mentors, and we need mentees. And that's the perfect circle, in a way, of coming together in connection.
But if I may relate that to upstream stuff again, like how much more, and this is why the Veterans Ranch is great, by the way, you identify it sooner if it's not too weird, and then you kind of get that passing of the torch sooner. So it's not like this one big handoff near the end. It's not this last minute thing. And that's what I find so beautiful. There's that. If I may name another intervention, so it's that. Yeah. And the second one, and I don't want to simplify it, but like it doesn't make it any less. It's any and some type of ritual, and like those that has its umbrella of different stuff, right? And so in hospice, we have something called We Honor Veterans, which I bet a lot of your viewers know very well. Lauren is probably I know she's very familiar with this, where NHPCO, they have this thing, you honor someone's service. You usually present them with a certificate / plaque, maybe a lapel pin, right? And then a coin, a challenge coin. But rituals tend to put words, or I should say, it tends to put meaning to things that we may not have words for. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I know people have different opinions about leading off with the We Honor Veterans for a new veteran hospice patient, but the reaction itself, given that the person presenting or the team present there can hold the space, the reaction is really telling, or usually is telling, of what further follow-up action needs to be. And so specific rituals before, during, and after the hospice episode is a big deal. So upstream, that literally may look like as simple as, hey, thank you for your service. Here's our Veterans Day thing at the Veterans Ranch. Or it could be like, hey, we're getting together as veterans. It's kind of a weekly thing we do, AKA ritual, right? Because it's consistent and it's not even really for a specific purpose. Things tend to pop out off of that. I know that space held in the ritual. So I got to name that as another common intervention as well. And it could be as formal or as informal, as the things mentioned, but it's a powerful thing.
Is We Honor Veterans, is that like a type of ceremony that takes place, like that the staff does something specific for a veteran on the service? Or I just was wondering how it works. Do they come together like formally to present a certificate or a pin to a veteran?
It could be as formal as like having the VFW over here in Central Oregon. We have an organization called the Band of Brothers. They're very similar to the VFW and American Legion. They might be insulted by that, but it's as formal as them lining up with a bunch of flags, right? And then being bedside next to someone that served, and then some person from the hospice saying, hey, we acknowledge your service as a ranger in the Army in the Vietnam War. Thank you for your service. It could be as formal as that, or it could be as informal as perhaps a hospice volunteer saying, thank you for your service. I've known you for a while. I remember, you were at Hacksaw Ridge in the Korean War. Thank you for your service. I know what that's like, or I have knowledge of what that was like. I could not be any more appreciative of you serving in that capacity, and it could be as informal as that, bedside, no one there besides them and that person, right? So, but the reaction, again, I usually point out the reaction. That's typically, does this need any further? Or does this need any further follow-up? Is there something there? And maybe it might come out in the next visit. Who knows? But
I was going to say, the hospice facility itself has a rating. Like, there's different classifications of measures that they have met as a facility to understand veteran care and support veteran care. And I don't have them in front of me, but basically, like, I think Partners in Care is either a level 4 or level 5. We honor veterans facility, and it just means that they have, met measures that for veteran care that have proven to be very helpful in supporting all these things we're talking about.
So that makes sense. So it has to do with the training that the hospice staff has received and kind of their passion or their commitment to how they care for veterans.
Right. So there's training, there's ceremony, there's community engagement measures that they can take, so it's this list of standards, and then they're following those standards to, and that's a great badge to look for. It's a national program, so no matter where you are, if you have a loved one that's going into hospice, look for their involvement in that program, because then your veteran is being treated with that level, that standard.
Absolutely. I will say other things that come to mind, ritual that worked for me really well in the past, and maybe it's the way I do it, but it's like the ritual of gift to veterans. So there's a guy from 2nd Infantry Division in the Vietnam War, and like I guess he just kept talking about it. And so what I gifted him was, in the Army we have these patches. Like I had a 2nd Infantry Division patch from like the current color our uniform is today, and I gave it to him, and it was like the most ice-breaking, relaxing thing in the world, right? And I remember another time we had a guy in the Marine Corps in some of your uniforms. Lauren was a Marine, so she remembers. They have this brass tie clasp with the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor for Marines. And I remember him saying something along the lines of, "Gosh, I wish I had something enough to remember the Marine Corps." And then like I just happen to have that in my car from something else, and like off the cuff, hey, this is for you. But it was like one of those gestures, and I consider it a ritual, but maybe some people might use different language for it. It's just those thoughtful gestures in the ritual and the reaction that tends to make, I believe it makes a big difference, because it's that really unique shared connection.
And that's another example of, like, to give the right gift, you have to have listened and have heard what this person needs or is looking for, and in order to pick the right thing for that person. So it's a good example of what you're talking about, holding space and listening and just being present and being respectful of that person.
Oh yeah, I would probably add, like, I've never seen an intervention work, no matter what it is, for any psychosocial, spiritual thing, if there was never the capacity or ability to hold space. No, those are the two predominant interventions I use, by the way, or I would recommend. It would be, especially for veterans at end of life, it would involve ritual and the concept of passing the torch for folks that are currently and still serving as a connecting of the circle, right? Talk about the circle of life.
Yeah.
There's something very similar to that in the veteran world, I would imagine. And if I may, I know we're talking about veterans, but I also see this with former nurses that are on hospice, or doctors rather. There's this very unique connection with, as you probably would know as well, Doctor, a nurse caring for a nurse. They're probably the pickiest because they're probably judging their hair. But, there's that connection. I see that banter all the time. That's what Lauren and I go through when we talk to veterans at end of life, right? So,
yeah, I really love that. And, ultimately, we're all humans. We're all facing our eventual death. And so the more for each one of us, even those of us who are non-veterans, the more we're willing to just be open and accepting of everyone, but also aware that each one of us has different needs and different issues going on, then the more I think we can show up for each other and be there and be supportive.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much the lowdown on interventions and pain. I gotta say thank you for making space on your podcast.
Well, I want to thank you, Wes and Lauren, for joining me. It's been great to talk to you and to learn more about what's happening in Oregon, and then also to address some of these ideas of upstream care and how we can make things better, not just for veterans, but for everyone.
Yes, thank you, Karen, for having us.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Wes Moldogo and Lauren Grigsby, and enjoyed learning a little bit more about upstream care for veterans. Be sure and share this interview with other people if you think they'd be interested in it, and subscribe and leave a rating and review. Thanks again until the next time we're together.